I'm going to try something I've never tried before. This is a continuous video, 45 minutes long, exactly what I was told to speak. And I'm going to narrate it as it goes along, although there will be some certain pauses in between. And I hope the folks up there in the control booth will control the sound a little bit so you don't get blasted away. First of all, I was really impressed by not only the conference, but the title of the conference. And, you know, squaring the circles is this extraordinary set of meanings, both in the Asian culture, you know, and current culture now. In fact, you've got people who are now going around talking about in the pop culture by putting their hands up in the air with the eye between, and you're starting to see this kind of a sense. Now, one of the issues was, you know, it's seemingly impossible. Well, that's the thing that, you know, it's out there. And obviously the task that we're doing is seemingly impossible in some ways, but that's, of the 30 or 40 definitions of squaring the circles that I found, the one that I thought was really the most incredible, that I think best fits what I do, is man's instinctive quest to harmonize our physical and spiritual natures. So that's all I will read. So let me begin this. And it is these two factors, this material world and the spiritual world, which need to merge. And I think I've tried very hard in my career to begin and try to do that. Now, I've been in the process of visioning the transformation of cities. I'm 72, so I've been at it for about 50 or so years, being a professor both at Harvard and then Rutgers for the last 40 or so. I've also been very, very lucky to have established a think tank, which has my name on it. And that particular think tank has developed a thing called a visual preference survey, which we use, and I've been told to focus mostly on the United States, but these are the spaces across the United States that we've actually worked on. And what we're looking for is people's viewpoints. Now, we've been asked to focus on the American example, and as you know, we're not going to grow as fast as China, but we're growing faster than Lisbon, roughly about 80 more million people by the year 2050. And America, as you know, set the American dream, or supposedly the American dream, which is now fading fast. We are a car-oriented culture, and that permeates everything we begin to think about, and all our land uses. And of course, we have a beleaguered middle class, where China is growing its middle class. We have a beleaguered middle class, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And we're fat and lazy. And fat and lazy has come from not much physical exercise and not actually much movement. But the first question is, what do people want? What do people want this future to be? And then the next question for us as professionals, how do we see what they want? How do you make that transference of one form or another? And that becomes important because really you're tapping into that cerebral feeling that's in people's heads, and you've got to try to find a way to get out of it. Now, I think that Wendy said, everyone in this room, we as academics and professionals, the wealthy, the powerful, the fashionable, the politically and the religious folks, but the average and the poor, and of course the millennials, who are the biggest workforce on the planet. How do we collectively put together some notion of what these people really want and what they see, not only in the present, but also in the future? And I think it's important that we start to look at that, and what we say is we want visionaries. Help us. And I am firmly believing that after all the work that we've done, that if we let people involved in the process, we get the most sustainable cities and the quirkiest and the most interesting set of ideas. And I, at the end, will show you just 5 of the issues. We call it design by democracy, and that is getting people involved with it, and particularly getting more and more millennials involved with that whole notion of, you know, health, happiness, and prosperity, which is universal in terms of what many of us say we want for the majority of our population, of course. So that becomes extremely important, but we've got to develop a realistic consensus vision. So it verges between the reality and then the future, but I am also convinced that it's based on your phase in terms of where you've grown up or born, in what phase of urban evolution. And this is a really simplistic diagram, but it's worked for almost all our clients, that urbanization goes through these 4 phases. It's formed, it grows, it optimizes, then it declines, and then it redevelops. And if we go back 12,600 years, which is about the oldest we can get, the Göbekli Tepe, we know that it was the first structure that we found on the planet, and it too optimized. And then it deteriorated and it grew and it changed into something completely different. But that notion of the optimization is what we really are striving for. How long can we keep things in optimization? And of course, we know we grow, we optimize, and we die. But in this particular case, cities go through this first phase of deterioration, and then they go through even more deterioration that we have seen in the States in certain areas. And then, of course, there's a vision for them to come back. And that's the hope. Hope, 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 hope is the big notion of the harmony of place. And that notion, we have found, this diagram has 9 influences. And some of them have already been talked about. But first of all, it's global climate change, of course, which have gone historically. But boy, did we get a wake-up call in New Jersey when Sandy hit. 75% of the people now in that area believe it.
Millions of viewers cannot see this broadcast because they're heading into another night in the dark.
This scared people for the first time. And of course, the movies we've been doing down in South America already show we got 3 inches or 2 inches of water. The solution, rebuild by design, add swamps and other areas to mitigate the surge. And other places now seriously looking at dams against the future surge and let private industry actually pay for it, or else, picking up the Dutch notion of the dikes. So this is all part of this new evolution. The second one, of course, is research and technology, which we can talk. I mean, it's a whole conference on that. But for me and my students, it's amazing what these new tools can do, that we have access to these computer labs, that these students can produce these phenomenal sets of information. Of course, biotech is beyond anything anybody believed. And, are we going to swallow robots? Absolutely. I don't think there's any question about that. But then there's the whole notion of leaving the planet. And we can see that's beginning. Sooner or later, we'll use the resources, and there's a certain number of us who will just get out of here and leave the planet as it is. So that's one thought. The other one is energy supply, which is is ubiquitous every place. As we continue to use more and more electricity, how are we going to generate it? Where is it going to come from? Do we have enough fuel to be able to do it? And then we see these new emergences. Of course, the solar has been a very important part of this thing, and of course, wind energy, but it's still a very small percentage of what we can actually do. Oil is still king, but this has really got some sense of future, of not an infinite future. And of course, it is what propels the American system, the American dream, which we transported to the rest of the world, which is probably going to be the biggest single tragedy ever. We know that as oil prices and gas prices increase, transit is going to increase, as it did in the United States when we had our first major bubble of it. And then, of course, resource availability. How much coal can you have? Where is the resources coming from? Americans are less concerned about that. As long as it's there and it continues to come, we don't care. So it does some pollution, so we're strip mining. Okay. What we're really concerned about is how much food is on the shelves in the supermarket. And what happens if there's a panic and all of a sudden 3 days later there's no more food? And now we see these alternative millennials coming along with alternative food capability. And of course, water is more expensive than gasoline, as you probably know. And water is this really, really important commodity that we really start to find. And of course, all over the world, water is something which is going to influence it. And it was talked about earlier. The other next major influence on this thing is what I call beliefs. And I want to talk a little bit more about beliefs. This is both culture and religious. And it's this formula, which I'll explain a little bit, which we're just starting to tap into. But that belief, that little B here, is probably the most important thing in terms of what's right and what's wrong, in terms of what people's thinking or what they've been told to think. And it goes back very ancient. Every ancient culture, we have absorbed engrams of this from the past. And whether it's the multiple flavors of Christianity or it's the multiple flavors of any other religion, there is a clear kind of vision of what is involved with what's right and wrong in those. And that has got to be a very important part of that formula, and adapting people to the future, of course. And then another part of this, of course, is economics. As we know, look what happened to the States in 2008. Everything came to a complete standstill. The chase of the almighty dollar or the yen or the euro, I guess it really doesn't make any difference. that notion that private gain is really what it's really all about. And we're seeing that diminished in some places. But, on the world stage, it's still currency markets and markets. The United States stock market dropped 500 points yesterday. Everybody's panicking all of a sudden. So these markets also affect, hey, what are we going to build, what we are not going to build? And another one of these influences, of course, is I call communication. And I put communication and politics together. And this literally is the power to control. We know that from top-down governments. But the media exposure has a new set of realities. And it started with television in terms of unsanctioned television. But look at these kids now, 3 years old, doing their own media experiments. And, of course, the collection of big data, which is going to be an extraordinary thing. And then you get, the control of power, whether it's the locked Congress we now have, which is really unbelievable, or we've got, Mr. Putin, getting back to us by sending us cyber banking problems because we have. So there is this power game, very big power game, both at local levels and at world levels, which are being played out as we speak here. And then, of course, the expected quality of life. What do people expect for the future? What is their notion? And the Americans, it always was, we're going to have this single-family house with three cars and a garage, and we're going to maybe have a truck, and won't that all be really good? And gasoline will stay cheap forever, and we don't have to worry about anything diminishing, except all of a sudden there's a new reality. A lot of people cannot have that dream, not only in the United States, but worldwide, and have to live in awful urbanizations like this, or like this, which we still have. That dream is only for a very selected top end. And what happens to these kids as they experience this lower level of expectation with people then telling them what to expect? That becomes a very important part of how this thing evolves. And, of course, population growth has always been the thing we've always talked about. Oh, growth is population. As it grows, we can begin to change everything. And, of course, we know the United States is only going to grow by 60 million. But the key there in the States is that everything is controlled by the millennials. Well, the banks are controlled by the millennials. It's still the baby boomer vision. And it's the millennials who are pushing up with a new vision. That is in contrast, I think, very much with the old baby boomer vision. This is Buffalo, New York, shot 2 weeks ago. Half of that city is empty. We've got cities all over the United States, and this is Atlanta. This is the proposal plan for Atlanta as Atlanta continued to expand because of continued immigration of people, and the desire now for younger people, particularly gays and folks like that, to want to be in the cities. And we see, where development is happening, cities are really coming along on a very kind of a positive basis. And then other elements, no matter how you look at that particular diagram, I like people to say, where are you or where is your city essentially on that diagram? And I'm saying if given the opportunities, no matter where you were born in this diagram, whatever urban environment you grew up with, everybody has a vision for what they want to live and work and play. And it's up to us to try to extract what that is. And not only just the future, but what do they think of the present, as well as what do they think about the future? And it's up to us, I think, in some cases, to try to deliver that, because what we want is satisfied people, obviously planetary-wise, to be able to lead us to the next 1,000 years. And so asking people to become visionaries, that big V, is a really important part. And this is just a kind of a little stimulus. What does that vision mean? First, it's experience. What have you totally experienced in your life, and what engrammic things have you inherited? Then it's your intuition. Oh, I think that's a great idea. And then there's this other factor on it, which is imagination. How do you put those together? And all of those three together combine to create this notion of vision. And it's in people's head. I think, as Wendy said earlier, you all have this in your head. How do we begin to pull this stuff out? How do we find something which is a consensus? And I think that by looking at kind of what people have experienced over time, and these are little flashes. These are not something which is stable. These are not dreams, because most dreams are negative. These are things I've experienced a little bit of, or I've seen a little bit of this on television, but I experienced this. Boy, I see that on a daily basis. Wouldn't it be nice if I had that? All of those things are instantaneous in people's minds. And we find that people can look at images and select whether they're positive or negative for them in nanoseconds. The question is, how positive or how negative actually is it? I love this one. It's an old Latin saying that says, the strong imagination begets the event itself. And this is believed by lots of people, that you have that ability to have that imagination. And here's some of the students I have. Build the town. Think about what this is going to be. What's perfect for you? And another one, this is an old Indian one that says, nothing happens on earth that's not first imagined in the mind. We just need to give the tools to that imagination. Now, just on this one, just in this room, raise your hands if you've ever been into a place that you felt you've been there before. You walk a completely strange place, and all of a sudden you go, gee, I felt like I've been here before. Yeah, well, look, it's the majority of people in the room. Of course, we all have that capability. What is that? And how do you begin to pull that out? Now, here's what we tried to do then, to try to put this together. And this has been an ongoing thing for now 40 years. It's called a visual preference survey. We have people look at a range of image types, which are pre-screened by feedback sessions. And we shoot a lot. Any town, we might shoot 4,000, 5,000 images, and then select those images and say, what do you think about that? And then get those down to the 20 to 120 images. And of course, the pre-testing is phenomenal because you get all this public interaction. Before we actually take it to the public, which says, okay, here's your vision, and we ask them this question: how appropriate, inappropriate is what you are seeing now in the future for you in this community? And what has been very interesting about it is that I'm going to show you the consensus. Kind of a notion of 5 things that came out as a consensus from these things we worked on. Now, our focus is primarily in the United States, although we have done work abroad, primarily for the State Department in certain areas. But is this better than that? What do you think? By how much? And at least we get some sense of it. And what's fascinating about it is, as I said, people can do this like instantaneously, but how do we put a value on it? So that was our first big question. We know people can do it positive and negative, so we tried, let's do a big scale, +10 to -10. And people go through this thing, ding, 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 yes, yes, yes. Nanosecond, I know it's positive or negative. But then they pause. How much is it negative or positive? And in this particular old-fashioned thing, we fill in a little dot. I like people to fill in the dots because they feel like they're action, or they could hit the thing on the computer, but it's a bit more anonymous. But both of them work extraordinarily well, and they always follow the same set of procedures. So what happens through all of these sets of kind of interesting numbers is this equation. And that A is the summation of the 200,000 people who've taken this survey with me over time, and their attitudes. These attitudes about, what do they think about something? Is it really positive or negative? And then the other one, is it good or bad? These are fundamental attitudes and beliefs. But then, normative behavior, what's normal to everybody else? That becomes a major factor in how they look at stuff. You got a cell phone, I've got a cell phone. But then the next one, which is added to this thing, is called motivation to comply. I want to be like everybody else. So all of these formulas, and then all of this is modified by your memory and your mood. And I told you, just beginning to scratch the surface on it. But I know people can go through this formula in nanoseconds, and when we explain it to them, they go, oh yeah, I understand that. We don't understand it completely because it is so complex in terms of how the mind works. But what's so fascinating about it for us is just watching people do it. And again, the more that we find that we've developed this consensus value. Scanning all of these images over time, and we come out with something pretty simplistic: a mean for the 200,000 people who took the survey and a standard deviation. And then, of course, this is modified by 2 other things, which will be the questionnaire, like who took it, and of course, then what we call, how do you translate the vision to a plan? Because a vision is not enough without it being translated into something absolutely physical. And we found that people can do that. And then we pull out the most negative and positive images. These are the soul, or the heart, if you will, of the visioning. Here's what I want, here's what I hate. The most 2 extremes give us a direction. And you can see from this one that we did nationally, you're going to see greening is one of the major issues. Now, what we do is we tap emotions, perceptions, and feelings. And these things are really kind of the intangibles of people. How do they feel about this place? And what is so nice about it is that there's all this kind of relaxation when it's done after they put the numbers in and go, I really hate that, I put a -10. Or I think this is really great, I give it a +10, although we've only had one image ever that ever got a +10. And what it leads to then is knowledge, understanding, and action. And what has been fascinating is seeing this translated first into kind of like sketches, and then it starts to solidify into color, and then inevitably it becomes reality. And those notions of it moving from vision to even beginning sketches that you promote back out there, I can't tell you how hopeful this makes people. Now, what does it do? It puts a value also on the quality of urban performance. How well is the existing urban environment performing right now? And here's what across the board, we found most of the existing urban environments that we've seen are in the negative category for almost everybody across almost every spectrum. Well, look at this one. Here's a little town we did, a very minus value, typical value. Look at this one. My gosh, let's take the parking away, infill housing, and make it walking. Now, these are just normal people doing this. It's not anything sophisticated about this whatsoever. And you'll see the next one that comes up here is this is one that's a dead shopping center. We have them all over the United States. We gave them lots of options. Well, what's the one that gave the highest score? Watch it. Turn it back to green. We're seeing the whole notion of returning to green as being a major, major component of the revitalization of cities, if you will, particularly those which are on the edge. And then here's a couple of national consensus visions. And these are, I think, roughly about 220,000. This is in the category of streets and roads. And this gets between a -6 and a -8 with a standard deviation. Everybody hates this all the time. It makes them nervous, depressed. They hate it. They go home and they beat their wives after they experience this on a daily basis. And this is ubiquitous in the United States. It's now become ubiquitous worldwide. This notion of strip commercial development by cars, and people fundamentally, emotionally really dislike this place. Dislike it. Well, and why, in God's name, are we continuing to produce more of it? Or are we producing more of it? Which I think we are, as the car remains the kind of the fundamental modus operandi. Now, here's another one, which is the positive side of it. This is in a category called urban housing. About 200,000 people have seen this set of images. And I literally could build this any place in the world, I suspect, but particularly in the United States, anywhere, and it will go positive by everybody. Look at it. It's like 5, 6 stories high, relative density. And, of course, the big one was Back Bay, Boston. We started shooting and putting that into visual preference surveys. And after a while, I just started retiring the images, because everybody loved Back Bay, Boston. I don't care if you're black, white, green, purple, rich, or poor. Everybody liked Back Bay, Boston. And because it's got specific characteristics. Okay, so visioning is part of it. The next part of it is, who took the survey? What kind of policy issues are they interested in? Can we correlate the vision to who they are? Do the older people think different from the younger people? Do they think alike in some of the imagery? Now you can see, I mean, look at the intensity of these people filling this out. So you got a young lady on one side, you got these 2 old guys. Look at the intensity of they're just absolutely into this thing. You know, do you think we should have a supermarket? Should we take away the traffic? Should we have more trees? You can ask these policy questions and correlate that back. And then you get these incredible numbers. I mean, should you make it more sustainable? What's this one? 72% want to live close to where they work. This is in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. This is the heartland. And of course, this one, this notion of having commercial areas close. Of the 1,200 or so or 2,000 people that took it, we got overwhelming responses. So if we're getting overwhelming responses that way, why are we not doing it? It's all theory and no go. And then, of course, the last one is, here's your vision. Translate it onto a plan. The intensity in these workshops is beyond belief. And then what we'll do is we'll have 50, 60, 100 design teams. We'll take their synthesis, put it on top of each other, figure out, and 80% of the people will have done the same thing in the same location. It's absolutely remarkable. You can produce comprehensive plans in 2 weeks. There's no doubt about it. If you simply look at what's there and take your professional expertise. Now, here's a classic. This is susceptibility to change. Where do you think, and this is maybe 60 teams, look where they all put the red. They all put the red in the same places. These are the areas we absolutely want to see change. And then you go to all the negative images in the visual preference survey, we find out they're corollary. Or the green stuff is where we don't want it. Or where's these new buildings? You love this new building? Where should this new building be located? Look at the cluster of these new buildings. Now, somebody's got to figure this out. It's like doctor looking at an x-ray. But nonetheless, you've got the fundamental basis by which you can begin to move. And of course, the more people, the better. Because the consensus just starts to become more and more center-focused. And this one was just one of the many stakeholder meetings. Now, clearly, if you have a vision, and these cities, which are great cities, have these visions and must have these visions, And it's going to be a place then where people are going to want to live. Now,
Appropriate,
I'm just going to give you these 5 primary visions. I could go on for hours and hours about this, but this is what I call consensus vision 1 across the board. Make cities walkable. Every time we look at the images go off the top, almost off the top of the scale. Continuously safe and interesting, and those are very important words. And of course, where do we learn this from? We learned it from Copenhagen. We learned it from the Asian cities we filmed. And the Americans just love this. But so does the rest of the world. And look what Jeanette Sadekhan did in New York. I mean, bought a bunch of lawn chairs, set it in the street, and all of a sudden it now got converted to one of the hottest pedestrian malls probably in the United States, which has now affected every city that I know of. This little one in Appleton, Wisconsin, took the highway and converted it to a pedestrian mall on the weekends. And all of a sudden there's like 20,000 people. Okay, look at this one, Newark. I mean, this is Jersey City, 3 weeks ago. That's what's the street before. This is a week ago. It's now going to be a permanent street. And if you look who's there, it's mostly millennials and old folks who have nothing to do. They are bored. And some of the things we're thinking about in some of the new towns we're doing, if people want it, well, let's just design it as part of the towns. Now, talk about millennials. This is Brooklyn. Hot. Every millennial in New York wants to be in Brooklyn, primarily because it's so walkable and accessible. Or this one we did in Overland Park, Kansas. When we added the pedestrians, it went from extraordinarily negative to extraordinarily positive. So all the evidence is there for that high level of walkability. Consensus vision 2. So, and these will sort of build on each other. Slightly lower in the numbers, but still yet extraordinarily positive in its overall approach. And that is multimodal, interconnected public transit. I mean, I cannot emphasize enough why we need to have public transit available everywhere. And there's lots of modes in which you can do it, including the notion we've been working with an on-demand transit system. It started in Curitiba. Everybody heard about Curitiba. We had to go down there and film it. We put it in the visioning process, and people going, wow, look at that. What do you mean? You got to move the bus stop? What do you mean people can get on and off? What do you mean they're moving 85% of the population to one town? And the European light rails, we love them. We're still building 4'8" beam-outs. And then, of course, we still have bus rapid transit, and that's always been a part of this. This was in Minneapolis earlier. People like this one, not so much. But what we've also found is that the transit stops must be within walking distance. Must be, and that walking distance must be pleasant. That's real clear. Now, what we've done is we've trailed people. You walk out, okay, one student, follow that person, see where they go. You follow that person, let's find how they go in 1 minute, 2 minute, 3 minute, 4 minute, and 5 minute lines. And of course, they become these isobars. And it's, we know the real numbers. I mean, the numbers have been there with transit guides for years, and that is the 5 minute walk from the beginning of commercial intensity and that 10 minute walk beyond that. And so we've started to working with. This is one we did in Austin, Texas. So this is where people wanted this transit stop to be. And of course, all the development was then focused, like it is in Curitiba and other places, within a 5 to 10 minute walk of that transit station. Here's the one in Overland Park. Woo, they fell in love with the bus rapid transit system. It was cheaper than anything. It looked kind of like a transit system. It ran on a track. That was really pretty cool. And when the synthesis of all the workshops, look what they did. They absolutely clearly laid out the 5 and 10 minute walking distance. Everybody buys it. And even help us design the stations. So those elements are very important in terms of providing multimodal transit and then linking it back to the notion. They would love to see everything interconnected, obviously. And there are ways to do that. Now look at this one again, repeat it. There you got the taxi, the walking, the bicycle, the transit in the back. It's the regional bus system. Or this one, which first 3 buildings start on this thing next week. You got the pedestrian, you got the transit, you got the bike, the taxi, and then, of course, across the sheltered place for people to wait, and then into a ramped underground system, which has the regional bus system and the path system, which is a connection. And this is now beginning to move ahead with the World Trade Center now being complete. This hopefully will follow that. And they want to connect it to the high-speed rail. So many countries are so far ahead of the United States on high-speed rail, of course. But we got 2 going. We got the one on the East Coast and one on the West Coast. So it's beginning to happen, and it's beginning to happen slowly, and it's primarily being pushed, I think, again, by a lot of the millennial folks who are actually out there. So that becomes an extraordinarily part of the kind of the new design philosophy that's being superimposed. And of course, this is a big one. What do you mean? You want to prioritize bicycles? In China, you were poor, you had a bicycle. Now you want a car. In Vietnam, you want a car. In Lagos, you want a car. You go to the more advanced countries, brains travel on bikes. What happened to Park Avenue? They took the cars off on a weekend, and all of a sudden, 50,000 bikes appeared. And those places, by the way, when you have transit, bikes, and pedestrians in place, like this is Amsterdam, I mean, everybody knows, my God, it's one of the glorious cities on the planet because it all works together. Now, out of all of this stuff, evolved this diagram. This is a 5-minute walk is the center, which is the most pedestrian, the most green, and less cars. The blue is a 10-minute walk, but then we've added a third one, and that's a 2.5-mile bike ride. And we have simply started superimposing this upon every major transit station and train station, as many as we can do, as fast as our GI system can push them out. And it's absolutely amazing when you look at the vacant, or potentially redevelopable land. And of course, GIS is this extraordinary tool which can help us do this like instantaneously. I mean, we have these tools for a reason, and they've only been in the last years. Consensus 3 is they must be greener, cleaner, and less polluting. If you're going to sell the future, greener, cleaner, and less polluting has really got to be the name of the game. Whether it's green roofs, but we need things to absorb more of the CO2. When we do these little simulations of just adding trees to a rooftop, they go off the top of the scale. Everybody going, yeah. That'd be a great thing to have. And these are all just virtual. But now, of course, they have to become reality. When we can provide open spaces that are part of people's everyday experience, not something you have to go to, but part of their everyday experience, the scales go off, the numbers go off the top of the scale. And what's part of that? Part of that's water. So water becomes a very important place. Places for people to sit, places for people to walk, and this what we call semi-public edge between the sidewalk and the building itself. And of course, these lessons we learned in Back Bay years ago, and these are all +8s across the board. All these lessons have been there. The question is that we've ignored many of these fundamental lessons. Introducing trees into the city, high enough that you can walk under, start to become a major important part of it. And of course, as I said before, letting mommy and the little girl have that same experience in the park as part of an everyday experience, not something you've got to take them to, which is very much of a different thing. And of course, when you have these parks, like Bryant Park in New York, the value of the real estate just becomes astronomical. Waterfront walkways, becoming big deal as we become deindustrialized. Waterfront walkways are now some of the cherished, highest value urban land now. This is Hoboken, New Jersey, with Henry Arnold's remarkable one. And of course, at any plan that we do, we not only add that, but we add wind generators and all the other things that pop people's eye. And of course, the great one now, after the one in Paris, is the High Line in New York. A whole new kind of a park, reusing old urban spaces. And here's one we did where we're just simply decking across an old railroad line. So the railroads are underneath here, putting the park on top, pushing the buildings to the side. And if you can go higher, but you have to help us pay for the park. So it becomes an incentive. And of course, then the value of the apartments go up, which is always the issue is that we never have enough well-designed places. And that's why the values are, in some cases, I think, are so extreme. So as we started to look at all of these kinds of these pieces, the consensus 4 says, all right, if we've got that, we must have places, must have centers. People want to go to a thing. They want to go to a place. They want to, as much as we think they want to interact on the network, they don't. They want to be with other people. That's why Google and those folks are so good about getting these interactive places together. And it should be the places where we have the highest buildings. I think Tokyo is probably one of the best I've ever seen. You can absolutely see how the transit lines work. The highest buildings are where two systems cross each other. It's so logical and so beautiful. And so you think about that and think, well, why can't that happen in other places? Well, it can, but the vision of that must be set. And of course, when it is set and we look at those places where the pedestrians seem to congregate, to me, it becomes a no-brainer. How do you get this stuff to occur? And you see most of the places in these centers are also carless. Now, the other thing is multi-use and mixed-use buildings. and they have to be in human scale. And this is all about the proportions of the streets and the heights and the widths. And the human being has got to feel comfortable. And this is probably one of the biggest things that we found out, that if the scale is wrong, people feel badly about these places. And when the scale is right, which means the height to the width of the buildings and the things in between it, somehow or another the human feels more comfortable. And of course, they seem to really like the notion of the mixed use, retail at the bottom level and some other uses up above. I was recently in Hong Kong, and I thought it was great. I mean, I was in a building that had 5 other uses in it. I thought it was glorious, and it worked perfectly well. Or this one in Boston, or this one in Washington, D.C., retail at the bottom level and something else. But this is the other really big one, redeveloping and infill underutilized buildings and lands. We have so much of that stuff. It was built at 1 story, which should go to 3 stories. And the biggest, if there's a sin in urban planning, the biggest sin in urban planning is what we did to our cities. And that is we let the car occupy the vast majority of the city space. And after that, the human being ceased to disappear. So there needs to be these vision, this one done with Mar Firm and Cooper Robertson in Newark, not only just capitalizing on the existing parking lots, but also moving air rights above existing rail lines. I mean, everything is fair game now because the walking distances become some of the critical factors. Consensus 5, and the last of these consensus visions, is minimize the use and dependence on the private car and parking in the city center. Now, we are still, well, this is how we condition our kids, right? This, just as soon as you can walk, this is what you get. By the grandparents who are baby boomers. Give the kid a car. And this is what they're going to expect. Almost every major highway in the country is totally jammed, as it is in Beijing, as it is in the rest of the planet. When in the hell are we going to learn? We can't build our way out of this problem. And the parking decks are atrocious. People hate them, particularly women, hate parking structures. Now, we got 1.1 person sitting in a car with 4.2 seats sitting empty, every place in the United States. I mean, I drive a smart car and I feel guilty because there's an empty seat next to me. But you look at any car, there's 1 person in it with enough capacity for 5. How did we ever sell anybody on this with 30,000 deaths? 200 deaths in New York City alone this past year. 30,000 people get killed. 200,000 get maimed. And of course, we're 34 hours standing still in traffic. I mean, this is becoming ridiculous. And of course, you have to be exposed to this all the time. No wonder you hate your kids. When you get home, you just feel so depressed and stressed out by having to look at that stuff. So a lot of people don't. They turn on the radio. Now, here's another one. For every car you got to put 6.1 parking spaces someplace. It's not a car for a car. You got to provide 6.1 spaces someplace. But look at this office building. The parking lot is as big as the total square footage of the office space. By the way, if you notice in the United States, these are all dying. Nobody wants to be in office parks anymore. And of course, the worst tragedy is that we bulldoze our cities for parking lots. And we've created all of this incredibly wonderful land. I'm going, these are like the land banks of the future. Anything that's in a parking lot is fair game for future development, and I think that is really one of the great things that's about to happen, that I think there's going to be a transformation, despite what Google says about driverless cars. I mean, this is in Newark. Before, completely negative, got -6 and -7s, and then you just do these transformations. And there's all sorts of things in every one of these images, how people look down at the ground for texture, how they want trees, et cetera, et cetera. But overall, if oil peaks by 2020, we have to start to think of these alternatives. The zip car, which is a good one, and this on-demand transit system, which is a perfect thing for suburban people that won't be able to afford their cars anymore. This is really a brilliant piece of work. And of course, what about congestion pricing, like in London, or just let's start higher parking fees? Are we going to have a revolt? Yes, but it's only going to be by the baby boomers. Here we try to confuse the car. Make it patterns every place else, and the car gets confused. Guess what? It slows down. It doesn't know how to act. Or here we camouflage a parking deck by putting a printed screen on it of a building that people love. Well, we're going to fool you this time, right? So we're going to actually make it look like something that it's not. That also helps. But when you have these visions like this project in Milwaukee on the river, we're looking for that optimum vision. And it will not be implemented unless it's promoted or branded, as some people say. And it's not just our reports. Those are really useless. They're nice for us, but they're useless. When it starts to move to the newspapers, when the newspapers start to get behind it, like they did in Little Rock for our planning in Little Rock, hey, you get a whole lot more response to it. But then there's been some really cool and interesting ones that, you start to get these overall bigger new perspectives that can happen, of course, with all the great tools we got. I think the greatest billboards I ever saw were in Dubai. I was just recently there again. I mean, I love them, 800 feet of billboards. Or this one, all promoting urbanism. This one that I shot 3-4 weeks ago in Amsterdam, the new red carpet to the train station. Get the public to understand what's going on. And then, of course, give them some notion of that vision of the future in both its abstraction, which most people don't understand, but then try to pull it at the bottom level. I think this model in Shanghai, when I first saw it, just blew me away. I had never seen anything like that before. The whole city laid out. This is what it's going to become. And people just wide-eyed at it. Now, I'm going to show you a little clip what caused America to be America. I'm just going to show you a little clip of this thing. It's called The World of Tomorrow.
Here is an American city replanned around a highly developed, modern traffic system. We see some suggestion of the things to come. A world with a future in which all of us are tremendously interested, because that is where we are going to spend most of our lives.
It was Democracy and Greenbelt all stitched together with the superhighways General Motors was counting on.
And boy, did we. Look at this. And now what we're doing, our biggest General Motors sales is in China. Good luck, China, on this one. But there's new ways the new technology can start to show things, and this appeals primarily to the millennials. This is what it could be, folks. Let our imagination go. Let's see what happens. Because if you don't have that imagination, how are you going to get the millennials to begin to think about something like that? This maybe could be for us. Now, you all know this, of course. We need to translate that into, physical plans and, of course, economic models and blah, 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 blah. It goes on and on and on. I'm really less interested in the economic models because I think if you got the right image, the rest of it just follows into place. But these have got to be solidified somehow or another in the public consciousness and in public regulation. And you can't just talk about it. It's got to be something which is clearly there. And I have to understand the 5-minute walk, which seems so fundamental to so many of us, but just is completely ununderstandable to so many people. And then it needs to be translated into, here's a possible code for what could get built where. You know that stuff. And perhaps some of you are, it's beyond ability to be able to do that. But we've found that these form-based codes have been really, really exceptional. Or the new things that kids seem to understand better is that turn it into 3 dimensions. Color it and turn it into 3 dimensions. This is the plan for Midtown Atlanta. And then make sections in these engineering drawings understandable by an 8th grader. They're not understandable by an 8th grader. Nobody's going to understand them because it's all legal mumbo-jumbo. And, of course, tie that back to the vision. There's a vision, there's a plan, and by God, also we got it built. Isn't this remarkable? Now, you all know there's these 4 stakeholders. It's the politicians, it's the professionals, it's the people, and, of course, it's the individual. And these 4 people have different ways. I'm concerned about the politicians and the wealthy because the mass money in the world is being concentrated in a smaller number of people who think they have the right to determine the vision for the rest, for them. And then, I want to be crude, but the hell with the rest of the folks. Just give them basically what they need and keep them pacified in some ways. When you get the politicians and the professionals together, sometimes it can turn out to be something really quite positive and beautiful, as it was in New York when Mayor Bloomberg said, we're going to go ahead and do this without any kind of input from the people, but the people just loved it. It was just remarkable. So there's things that can happen, obviously, but most of the time I've found that professionals, I really found professional planners, have created some of the most ugly, inappropriate, and unenvironmental places ever and codified that into zoning. I mean, look at this, trying to make this a single-family development by taking other buildings away. It's just unbelievable. The people are the ones that suffer the most, I found. I work a lot in cycles where people hire us at the bottom end of the environmental scale. They want me to give them hope. And I try best to do that, but I'm going, I can't give you hope. What I can do is I can find out what you think is hopeful. And so we typically start with that, but we have them evaluate their own environments first. If you don't know what they think about the current environments, there's no way you can plan for the future. I mean, look at these values. I mean, these are people from that neighborhood. These are Afro-Americans from this particular neighborhood who hate the places in which they live. And can you imagine a 1 and 2 and 3-year-old kid walking by that every day of the week? You wonder why so many of these kids are in prison or in drugs? Well, I would be too if I grew up like that. So it's what these children experience that we find extraordinarily important, and we try to pull sometimes these workshops down to roughly about the 4th grade level. What about this as a bus stop? Isn't this a cool and interesting one? Wouldn't you feel really happy waiting for your bus there? Or look at this place in Overland Park. That's kind of, we reverse simulated. Said if you don't do something, it's going to get like this. It's like what Wendy was saying. And then, of course, the key factor from sociologists and psychologists is depression, hopelessness, fear, anger, and then revolt. And it goes in that order. And I'm really totally convinced it's as much about the physical thing as it is about the economic thing, but the economic thing affects the physical thing. Now, if you look at the individuals, this is the Occupy movement in New York, which got so much publicity. And you know, did you see that stuff in Hong Kong with all these people filling that highway? It was just remarkable. And you know, these kids are looking for alternatives, and they're willing to do the bicycle stuff. And of course, as we started to look at that in places where they're doing it, it's really been pretty interesting. Now, if we can get them all together, in the cities that we've been most successful, all of these people are together because we give them all an opportunity to be part of it. The politicians particularly I want to see the politician's vision as well as, you know, the poor guy on the street's vision of what it is. And that's when we obviously have been the most successful, because everybody then shares in the pie. Now, that ultimate vision is obviously we want to stay at that high level, and we can only move there, of course, when we got world markets and employment opportunities. We all know that, and that's a seminar by itself. This is a clock of the world population. About 100,000 people we're adding a day to it, the lives and deaths. I always find this little clock really interesting, looking at the growth in population. Imagine a city, planning another city for 100,000 baby boomers. I mean, 100,000 babies coming up, and we know cities are going to get to be bigger and bigger. At least selective cities are going to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and how you begin to deal with that. So in conclusion of all this stuff, fundamentally, it's like every human being on this planet has a right to his or her vision. And until we really start to capitalize on that, I think we're just going to be spinning our wheels, because first of all, you have to understand what their individual vision is, and it's going to be different in every place. But I suspect it's going to have the same fundamental set of principles at the bottom level. I fully expect that's what would be, but it'll be manifest itself in different ways. And of course, the collective vision that people have in their heads. And I think it's to give harmony in some way, because we've got a planet to be considered very objectively. It's not China, United States, and it's the whole planet that we need to work with. And as we start to look at that, there are ways with the new internet we can do that. And then the last piece is just please allow people to translate that vision onto a plan, as crude as that plan may be. It has done remarkable things in terms of people's ability to imagine and to give them hope. And of course, what we find out is that I think, is one of the keys to squaring the circles. Thank you guys very much.
Okay, we are a little bit tight with the time, but first of all, thank you very much. It was an amazing presentation. Please, Anton, I believe we can invite people to make 2-3 questions. My will is to start a conversation for the next 2 hours, but it will not be possible, right? So 2 questions, very synthetic, very fast questions, and very synthetic answers. Yes.
Hi, my name is Marshall Brown from IIT in Chicago.
Hey, Marshall.
Couple of questions. One, methodological. What encourages fundamentally your belief in consensus as a productive model for thinking about urban futures, especially compared to the presentation we heard just before yours? Also, related to that, where is the space for the minority opinion or the dissenting opinion in your project?
Well, first of all, what made me believe it is 40 years of doing it. And the first projects that we did way, way back when, we can now see that the vision is still there and people are still essentially following through with that vision. And it's because 99% of the people have no capability of understanding a plan. I mean, that's fundamental. So you've got to make it visual in some respect. So we've seen it implemented. So that was the thing that really made me believe it. And secondly, the dissenting opinions are the most interesting, in fact. When, for instance, if you do a plan, and we've done it in completely ethnic communities one way or the other, whether it's in Los Angeles at a completely Hispanic community or Afro-American communities, it really doesn't make any difference. What's really cool about it is that when we look at the consensus, we get some incredible sets of ideas that come like, we would have never thought about that in a million years. And you take those opinions in place. Everybody who has an opinion, and everybody puts a marker on a mark, has some validity for us to begin to look at. And that has really turned out to be quite remarkable. We have found, though, in the Afro-American community that they are much more brutal. That is, they are much more, want things to change at a much, much faster rate, obviously. But the things they want, I also think, are fairly realistic. And in fact, I can go long stories in North Philadelphia and places where the simple things would just clean the place up. And then we ran into bureaucratic things saying, well, we can't deliver that. And that was, for us, really heartbreaking.
Okay, one more. I believe that
Darryl Ochoa, Griffith University, Australia. Thanks very much for that talk. It was very interesting. What worries me is that you constantly referred to the problems with the planning profession. But as you'd appreciate, in countries like yours and mine, planning occurs in a political context. So I'm just wondering whether you see any benefit in taking your work or extending it to the land development industry, the housing development industry, and politicians who ultimately make the decisions, not the planners.
Well, what's really interesting is that the places that we've done the best work, quite honestly, are those where, I'll just give you 3 examples. The mayor doesn't show up at all. Nothing gets done. The mayor shows up, but sits against the wall and won't participate. Right? The mayor participates fully in the process, and it gets done. And the same thing with the development community. Like it's same scenario. If they don't show up, forget it. If they lean against the wall and they just want to watch, that's something else. But those places where they've been most successful, particularly for the development community, is where they participate because they can see, why spend all this money on market research? Well, it's right in front of you. And if you can deliver what people want, there's 2 things I can promise. If you can deliver what people want, you will be reelected politically forever. And secondly, if you're a developer and you can develop what people want in relatively high density, you'll make more money than you could also conceivably imagine. So I think those 2 pieces are together. Now, I only fault planners, and I'm a planner myself, because a lot of them have simply done what they're told, as opposed to following and for instance, even getting to think about the future is difficult because they're so locked in what was the latest case study and what was the latest legal settlement that was done. So the notion there of a visionary mayor, let's say Jamie Lerner in Curitiba, look what he accomplished. That if you can get the mayors to start to think about a vision and not just policy. I'm so tired of policy. Because policy is blah, 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 blah. People want to see a vision. And it may not be the correct vision, but it's a positive vision that moves it in a positive direction. And it'll morph over time. And guess what? If you do the vision 6 weeks or a year or 2 years later and you recalibrate that vision with the new stuff that's happened, it's even going to get better. Now, we've got all capabilities of doing that. And it's particularly the big revolution is this. We could redesign the world with this if we simply had the capability of doing it and we had enough people together to make that happen. And I think we can see it happening now in the flash mobs. We can see it happening in the Arab Spring. We can see it happening all over the world now. The question is, it's a phenomenal tool. And my discussion always has been, why have we been given these tools now? When I started school, I'm 72 years old. With T-squares. Right? And now we've got tools that can produce this stuff. We can see anything from the world, any place, at any time. Why are we given these tools now? At the same time that population is expanding and disparities in this world are bigger and the environmental issues are bigger. Why have we been given these tools now? I think those tools are there for a reason. And it's a collective assembly of the phenomenal brains in this room and the phenomenal visions in this room, which I think could steer the course of the planet, and it will.
Okay. Nice to be here. Wonderful to be back in Lisbon. I agree with Wendy. Spent a year living in Lisbon. It's one of my favorite cities. It's definitely top 3 cities. So bear with me, because I think the 3 research keynotes are very complementary, although I think they're quite distinct and quite different. They cover different ground. So we're going to take a shift. We're going to take a shift into one of the areas that this conference is about, and that is resources, and in particular, urban resources. And so that's what my presentation is all about. Basically, what I'm going to do is show the research that I've been doing for about 7, 8 years, and give you hopefully some useful outcomes to put in perspective what we're doing. Okay. First of all, thank you, Olivia, Andrea, and Luis. Appreciate the invitation. Thank you to the Gulbenkian Foundation as well. Beautiful setting. And it's, as was mentioned, we're continuing to work in Lisbon on the MIT Portugal program, which brought me to Lisbon here several years ago. When we first started talking about my involvement in this conference, essentially 2 topics came to mind. And so these are the 2 topics I'm going to talk about today. I want to be really clear because the different research projects deal with different aspects of these 2 things. The first is urban metabolism, as already mentioned, and this is essentially the study of resources required by cities. Okay, that's all it is. So it's all about physical things. It has nothing to do with social issues, environmental justice, none of the political governance. It's about physical things: water, material, energy. Okay, so the first question that comes up, well, why don't you do any of those other things? Well, because a lot of other people are doing those other things. And when you talk about sustainable cities, the number of topics that can contribute to understanding cities is endless. So it was my decision several years ago that what we don't know is what are the resources required by cities and how much do we consume. The purpose of doing that is to suggest what the future might look like. So if we are adding an enormous number of people to cities in the future, and I'll talk about that, what are the resources that are going to be required to do that? And what are the possible futures? So I want to embrace this idea, Wendy's idea, or the coupled notions of diversity and complexity. I think that's absolutely the way to think about this. The second topic is in the title, again, transitions. So the first question that comes up when you're looking to transitions about some future state is transitions to what exactly? And that's a really important question when it comes to cities, because taking diversity and complexity in mind, keeping that in mind, we have a whole number of different transitions to a whole number of different potential futures. I want to stress that thinking about urban futures involves thinking very deeply about the urban past. So I'll show some work about that. I also want to refer to Manuel Salgado's statement that cities are neither paradise or hell. Actually, in my view, cities are both paradise and hell. In the world, I have spent a lot, I'm fortunately a little bit browner than a lot of people, and so I can sort of go native in places like Lagos and Mumbai, and I've spent a lot of time walking in places that tourists never get to, and hell on earth is in the city. So let me just tell you that. And so the question is, where are we headed? Are we headed more towards a paradise or more towards a hell? And so I'll give you some research that we've been doing for that. Okay. One last thing I want to say before I actually begin is that 5 years ago, we knew virtually nothing about urban resources. We know a tremendous amount today, and there are a number of different groups working. Paulo Ferrao at Instituto Superior Técnico here, and many others, Chris Kennedy in Toronto, Anu Ramaswamy in the States. A lot of people working in, well, a certain number of people working in urban metabolism, people who are really concerned with what are the resources required by cities. Okay? So the more we know, however, in any good field, the more you know, the more you realize how little you know. And so there's a lot of work left to be done. Okay, so enough of that. Okay, so some of the things that we know. A lot of people know this, that essentially around 2008, depending on what data source you're looking at or who you're talking to, the world went substantially from non-urban to urban. So most of the world lives in cities today. A lot of us know this, we've heard this. Well, what a lot of us haven't heard before is something that we put together, took quite some time to put together, and others like Fridolin Crossman and Helga Wies put together the data for what kinds of resources do we require globally. So we consume, and the Global Footprint Network also does some of those work, we consume resources, how much of it is renewable, how much of it is non-renewable. And around 1960, we went from a substantially renewable society. We were consuming more renewable resources than non-renewable. That's different today. After 1960, we essentially went to non-renewables, or we are now substantially consuming more non-renewables than renewables. Why is that? So one of the reasons for this is a more industrialized globe, and part of that is a more urbanized world. And an urbanized world means a world made of glass, steel, and cement. So in one of the previous talks, somebody mentioned that is what we deal with, the materials themselves. So, you know, you've also all probably seen urban projections like this, and Asia's going to take off, and Africa is going to be a huge contributor to urban population growth. And the reality is, if you read UN population projections, you know, most of this is going to be happening. So the vast majority, something like 85 to 90% of the addition of urban population is going to happen in what we know of as the developing world, in the global south. So a lot of urbanization, you know, these visions of sustainable cities and, you know, Michael Bloomberg's and all these beautiful skyscrapers and all that, actually a lot of it's going to be like this, a lot's already, I mean, obviously these are existing places. And look at this urban infrastructure. Well, this is not bad. Maybe, you know, it's serving two purposes. You can walk on it and you can also get rid of sanitation. But do we really want to do this? I mean, so this is more, let's just be real about the urban future. A lot of it's going to look like this. So the question is, what can we do about that? The other thing I want to mention in terms of urban futures is look at the immediate past. So as you might also know, we have gone through and are continuing to go through an urbanization globally that's at rates that are unprecedented. So this is a picture, the best one that I could find, of a little fishing village of somewhere around 40,000 on the southeast coast of China, which became Shenzhen only, you know, a few short decades later. Shenzhen's 14, depends on how you count it, but 14 million, let's say. So it's an enormous, nothing like this has ever happened in the history of our species. And we will be seeing a lot more of it. But what's the resource consequence of that? We can talk about all sorts of other issues, but let's talk about the resource consequences. During the 20th century, from 1900 to 2000, this is the total amount of material extracted from the earth. This comes from a paper from Krausman, the data itself. And so everything that was extracted, renewable and non-renewable, 7.4 gigatons at the beginning of the century, 20th century, and upwards of 60 and 59 at the end of the 20th century gigatons. So there's an enormous increase. However, the black is renewable materials, right? Biomass. The rest is non-renewable. So the proportion completely changed, right? So you can see it here as well, how we are becoming more dependent on those minerals and metals, and people can talk about scarcity of materials and all. Coupled to that, let's think a little bit about what we're really considering when we think about sustainable cities, what is a sustainable city? An urban future that may be sustainable? Well, I actually think that the discussion that we're having about sustainable cities in the last few years and still is a little bit like the beginnings of the discussions on green buildings 25 years ago. And that's, people talked about green buildings generically. And the fact is that every city is different. And in fact, I'll talk about some work in which we develop a typology of cities, but there are groups of cities that are like one another, but you have very, very different kinds of cities. So one of the things to do from the beginning is to talk about what's the lifetime of a city, what's the life cycle. So green buildings are dependent on a life cycle notion, understanding the materials input, the embodied energy, the embodied carbon, the use phase, energy consumption, and then the end of life decommissioning, and then renewing or reclaiming materials, recycling materials. And we don't really do that yet for cities, but we're starting to. So this is a diagram, very general diagram, essentially promoting the idea of phases in a city. And we've mapped this to a number of different cities, and it works pretty well. The time scale can be anywhere from, in Shenzhen, this can be, say, 20 years, or Rome, it could be 2,000 years, right? So the first phase is in rapid urbanization, a founding of that city, the establishment of the basic structure for the infrastructure and the built environment. The second is the physical space and the extent of the city and the material outlines of that city stabilize. Basically, it starts to solidify. The third is you get incremental densification. And you can apply this to lots of different cities. One of the reason to do this, besides just being an academic thought experiment, is that the consequences for material input, remember, I'm only interested in physical things. Given the life cycle of a city, what does this mean for physical things? So the ramifications for material and energy are very different. For material, it goes up and it goes down. Basically, once you've established the extent of the city, it's no longer growing significantly, then the material input per year would go down. It doesn't go to zero, but it goes down, right? So it hits a peak at some point. Energy is completely different. In almost every city that we've ever looked at, and I think I have consensus on this in my community, energy for a healthy city, a city that's not shrinking, but a healthy city per capita, energy almost always goes up. And it continues to go up. Why? It was said today, things that city do, things that I think Salgado said, things that the thing that city does the best is create wealth. That's why cities exist. They're agglomeration economies. So when you get wealthier and wealthier, you want more. So amenities. Our amenities today are energy intensive. We did a study of buildings on the Upper East Side in New York, admittedly a very affluent neighborhood, to see what the potential was for significantly decreasing their energy consumption of fossil fuels by installing photovoltaics on the roofs of those buildings. The survey showed that on average, the number of screens, iPads, iPhones, screens, television screens, screens on appliances, was 45 per apartment. So as affluence increases, right, energy goes up, and generally, and there are only a couple of very isolated and debatable, in my mind, debatable examples of where the energy starts to get dampened, and maybe in some Northern European cities. Now, you hear a lot about net zero energy cities and zero carbon emission cities. You can quote me, I don't believe in any of that. We're nowhere near any of that. We're so far from that. We're still on an upward trend. So I think we have to be a little real about the idea of sustainable cities and what that actually means. Okay, so one image, just to put in perspective as well. This is actually quite a fabulous development in China. I can't name it because I'm consulting on it. It's a proposal, but it does everything. I was involved in commenting on their sustainable priorities plan. And I could do a poll of what does sustainability mean, and 99% of what you come back to me with are in this plan. They do everything. Water reclamation, everything. But this thing is an addition to the building stock. This is an addition, and this is in addition to affluence. This will create greater affluence in this, which is all a good thing, but the absolute amount of material and energy, just generally resource consumption, will increase, even if you do everything possible to make it sustainable. Okay. All right, so now that's all kind of a prelude to two different areas. I have 21 minutes left. So 2 different areas. One is urban metabolism, the other is transitions, transitions and typologies of cities. Urban metabolism is just a study of physical flows. It's nothing more than that. And how we do it is we account for those physical flows. So this is a master diagram. Sorry, this is mind-numbingly complex. It's not useful to really look at, so just bear with me as I talk through it. So this is essentially the urban economy. So if I drew a line, and somebody talked about the boundary between the city and the rural, well, there are actually methods where you can delineate a system boundary. One of the ways is to do it economically or population density or whatever. There are various different methods. But if you draw a line around and you have some confidence about the robustness of that line, well, essentially, the top part of this, the inputs, the drivers for that input, these are inputs are water, air, solar radiation, and then the outputs on this top part of the diagram is all passive. This is the biogeochemical cycles. This is the natural world. So right out there, a lot of flows happening out there, but we don't really control it in any significant way. These are the active inputs, and these are the drivers. And this is our economy, our anthropogenic economy. It is driven by, so that's what that is, it is driven by 3 things. And this goes back to urban economics, right? So if you look at the accepted notions of agglomeration economies in urban economics, it's driven by 3 things. Goods and services, which is huge. It's pretty basically everything besides the built environment and infrastructure, so how the buildings and all the resource infrastructure, and then transportation. These 3 are the essential characteristics, the essential things that you need in a city. Those things drive inputs. So there are active inputs and water, energy, materials, biomass, and there are a number of different other things here having to do with where it comes from. And then the outputs. So material flow analysis is the methodology that I'm describing here, is the basic methodology for understanding the urban metabolism or the physical metabolism of cities. Okay, so now a few projects, urban metabolism projects. The first is, so one of the questions we asked a little while ago was, if we want to know what the transition into some future state, post-fossil fuel, how about trying to understand what pre-fossil fuel urbanization looked like? So we've done a few projects on ancient cities. The interesting thing about ancient cities is they're easier to understand and analyze than contemporary cities. 2 reasons for that. Data. So anthropologists are very good at actually describing the economies of ancient cities. It's an easier task, and that relates to the second point, that the economies were much, much less diversified. They were not making iPads back 8,000 years ago. They didn't need rare earth metals. So the flows were much, much more reduced, and so it's actually a lot easier to understand just the basic physical flows that were required by the human activities that you can characterize as agglomeration activities within a certain space. Caral, Peru was discovered by an anthropologist by the name of Dr. Shady in Peru, and now about 22 years ago. I'm gonna get that wrong, but and she's made a very credible argument that it was the largest New World city at the time, a population between 5,000 and maybe at its height 10,000. So this is a city, town. You have to go back to some basics though. So back then, let's say, Neolithic human material consumption, tons per capita per year. So this is just a person. And I'm now going to use tons per capita per year in a number of different projects, so keep these numbers in mind. Per capita for Neolithic was something like an input of 6 tons per capita per year. Okay. Today, our general consumption, and this is including a lot of indirect inputs, is, and you can argue with it, and this is a rough number. It change, dramatically different if you're in Lagos or if you're in Singapore. right? So 89 tons per capita per year, and a whole lot more effluent, partly because we deal with it. We don't just leave it somewhere, okay? So take that and put that in mind. We have a number of different urban metabolism projects in South America. Caral is actually located in a still active agricultural valley in northeast of Lima. I think technically it's northwest, slightly northwest. And it was the largest city among a series of settlements, traded with the coast, and developed a number of simple tools and had a well-developed agriculture, irrigation, and all that. Okay. They had a highly, highly structured social, they're very well-developed social structure. Difference between an ancient city and a city of today, like in China, a new city of today, is almost every ancient city was founded partly agglomeration economy and all that, but also fundamentally on religion. It was a seat for religion, seat for spiritual authority. So in the center of Caral, you have these temples, and the temples are surrounded by the 1%, the wealthy households, and then you get layers coming out of that. So that just some images showing you, just giving you some sense of the scale. The center is about a kilometer or so in length, but it goes on for another couple of kilometers along the valley. Okay, so one of the things that we do, and this we do for all of our work, is we structure our studies in terms of what is the growth of the population, what are they actually doing, what are the activities, and what consequences does that have on the flow of resources. I won't go through each one of these in detail, but this is system dynamics work, and the systems that we choose to map should have some direct relation to something, physical thing that's happening, either increase in population, increased use of biomass, increase in food, whatever. Okay, so the conclusion I'm going to show you like 4 or 5 different projects. So the conclusion of this work gives us a ballpark for the consumption of materials. So in an agrarian urban economy, so this is a pre-fossil fuel economy here in Peru, the consumption was somewhere around one ton per capita. So you saw the Neolithic was 6. That Neolithic number comes from Northern Europe. So they had to do a lot more with because it was colder. So this is a fairly moderate climate. So here in Caral, about 1 ton per capita per annum. So a fossil fuel urban economy, just from other work that we've done and that Paulo Ferrao has done here in Lisbon, is somewhere between 20 and 50. So just to put it in perspective. So the question, this is pre-fossil fuel. I think it's, and we'll talk a little bit more about targets, I think it's a little unrealistic to think we're going to go to 1 ton per capita per year again. So it's not 0. It can't be 0. It's going to be something. So let me show you another project, Lisbon, Portugal. So the majority of this work was done by Paulo Ferrao. I want to give him due credit and his team, and in partnership with us in the MIT Portugal program. So Paulo had done the materials matrix for Lisbon and had arrived at these numbers. And maybe some of you know this very well. Very useful study that, okay, the imports, the types of materials, and the exports, the wastes primarily. And if you go to the total of direct material consumption or domestic material consumption, 2004, Lisbon was about 20 tons per capita per year. Okay, so at the lower end of that 20 to 50, one of the reasons that is that Lisbon was back in 2004, and I think you've kind of returned to being a transition economy. So I think you kind of got out of the transition economy for a few years, and then the crash hit. So you're at about 20, which is fairly efficient for a industrialized place. Let me go to Singapore. Now let's talk about the other end of the scale. Singapore is touted as an extraordinary success, and it is. If you go there, the one photograph that Wendy showed, I'm sure that building doesn't exist any longer. It does? Okay. But those buildings are absolutely slated for redevelopment. Nothing happens in Singapore without the master plan, and there's continual reconstruction all the time. And so 40-story buildings are demolished to build 75-story buildings, right? So I think Singapore is seen as a real model for urban sustainability. In fact, they have a huge marketing effort to define themselves as the model city for the future. So let's talk about their resource consumption. One of the great things about doing work in Singapore is there's a fabulous amount of data, and it's a very, very tight time scale. So we're talking about 60 years. So from 1960 through to 2005, we've been doing work in Singapore now for about 4 years, and we've tracked urban mobility, built environment, and goods and services, inputs, outputs, extraction from the island itself, which is virtually zero now, in additions to stock. Over that time, inputs this is almost now it's close to 100% if you don't include consumer items. Then it goes way down because Singapore produces some consumer items. But it is the inputs in terms of materials is basically in Singapore imports almost everything. So it's a very clean model for us to look at. And one of the things that we found is that let's advance the discussion of sustainable cities a little further. And let's not just talk about resources or materials. Let's talk about different kinds of resources. And then let's try to characterize their increase in use, intensity of use, given the increase in affluence. Because we want an increase in affluence, even if it's a not capitalist model. You want some increase in what we define as affluence. The definition of affluence can change, but whatever. Okay, so in terms of the direct material consumption, or the total basket of materials, the relationship between a gross national income, so y-axis is a resource, x-axis is affluence, it's gross national income. It's one measure of affluence. These slides look kind of dim to me, so I'm not quite sure if you can see them. Anyway, I'll describe the relationship between the increase in national income and the increase in the total amount of materials used is essentially exponential. It increases exponentially. So as income increases exponentially, the increase in the total amount of materials used will increase exponentially. For electricity, as income increases exponentially, electricity increases linearly. And the latest work that we have shows that there might actually be a dampening of the electricity use, possibly. Electricity, not total energy, but electricity itself. And then water, almost naturally. Singapore is a particularly important case because they think about water in very, very in security-related terms. But in a lot of other places, in the United States, a number of different cities, in Europe, I think a number of different cities, you can actually dampen the water consumption pretty easily. I say pretty easily with some hesitancy, but you can do it. Okay, now let's talk. I do want to say one thing. The overall accounting that we did for Singapore, back when we finished the work a couple of years ago, was that Singaporeans consume something on the order of 125 tons per capita. So just to put those numbers in perspective, the agrarian was the Neolithic was 6, the agrarian in Kara was 1, Lisbon is 20, and Singapore is 125 a few years ago. We think it's actually up probably close to 140, 150 tons per capita. So an enormous diversity in resource consumption across the world, across cities. So we have to think about cities in very, very different ways, different kinds of cities in very different ways. So just, I have 7 minutes. The Boston Back Bay, it was referred to in a previous presentation. Going from that larger scale understanding of cities and resource consumption, now we are going to a neighborhood scale level. Boston Back Bay is a historic neighborhood, and we asked the question, do we understand what the resource consequences of this neighborhood has been over time and what it will be? So clearly there's value, people value this neighborhood because of its historical legacy, but we wanted to understand what has been the material investment in this neighborhood. So we actually did, this is I just went by that. So this is actually an accounting of the buildings. I also love GIS. And analyzing construction types and development cycles, and produced a map of the actual construction itself. But then we extended the project and went even to before the construction of the buildings to the actual making of land. So this is Back Bay somewhere in here, and it was filled. Sorry, it does not come. Yeah, I guess this is showing the original shore. This was all fill. So there was an initial import of material. So again, asking the simple questions. To make the Back Bay, what was required? And we went through different stages of analysis. We accounted for the overall building weight per floor area, and then accounted for, and this just gives you a heat map on that for different construction types. And then really started mapping. What is the material history of this neighborhood? So what's actually the material legacy? So what's the urban metabolism in time of this neighborhood? Obviously, there's a lot of construction, late 19th century, and then sporadic construction, quite a bit of demolition as well, and some replacement of buildings over time. But the cumulative investment, material investment, so this is cumulative building weights over time. It only goes up. So the basic message here, and the message, what we've been working with with the Neighborhood Association of the Back Bay, is for them to understand their material footprint from the beginning of the founding of the Back Bay, so that they can speculate on what they're willing to add to that investment in the future to become energy efficient is their main goal. And because it's a historic neighborhood, they will never get to net zero energy. They will get to dampen their current energy consumption, maybe 20%. Okay? It's a very affluent neighborhood, and they'll never get to zero. Okay, so those are a series of projects on classical urban metabolism. If you want to know more, I'm going to fast forward through these slides because we are short on time. You can go to this site. So what we did was, after a lot of this sort of the more classical study that we did, where you're just accounting for the resources in a particular place, we thought it's not that useful to do this over and over and over again. So can we develop a tool in which you can go into a city, you can outline an area, and I'll just show you. So if you go into this tool and you input, say, a city like New York City, and you get a Google map and you outline an area. This is a rectangle. So you can do that all with this menu. It's very simple. You draw, and then you analyze. This area is what the tool is considering, the buildings and the streets and the people here, for a material, so a kilogram per household, and an energy per household, kilowatt hour per household. It'll give you basically a return on the material and energy intensity of this neighborhood. It's interesting to go into this tool and go into different parts of the city. And because it's per capita, it doesn't matter how many households there are, but it'll give you a comparison apples to apples. It's interesting how different urban form has different material and energy intensities. And so this is trying to link the form to the resource. So I'm gonna fast forward through these, because you can just go to the tool, you can get a report, and we did a survey of who was using it, architects and engineers alike, and just to focus on this right here, maybe you can see it or maybe you can't, just out of interest. Most people, 95% of the people, were interested in a block or a couple of blocks or in a whole neighborhood. They weren't really interested in the whole city, and they weren't interested in one building. So this is, but architects as well, not just the planners. Okay, so let me move on to the last project, and that is to try to bring this all together. One of the things that we set in motion a few years ago was the idea that looking at cities from now until my career is over, for me, individual cities, is maybe it doesn't build up to something more generic, something more translatable to different places. So one thought we'd had was, for all the cities for which we have data, which we had several hundred cities, can we start to classify them? Can we start to group them? If you just did statistical analysis on them, could you actually begin to see groupings of different kinds of cities? And so we did this work. It's ongoing, and I know Paulo Ferrao and João Fumega, who's here today, one of his students, are continuing this typology work. We're also continuing the typology work. So the question is, if you can do that, maybe you can apply appropriate technology suites and policies to individual types. instead of just reinventing the wheel every time you go to a city, new city, right? Also, possible for regional and international cooperation. So if I know my city in Africa is like a city in Southeast Asia, there's a good reason for us to talk about sustainability on similar terms, right? And the rest is self-explanatory. I'm not going to read through them just for the sake of time. The analysis was done on consumption. So this is urban resource consumption. It was a statistical analysis. And essentially, we have been doing a lot of case study affirmation. So as you do a statistical analysis, you're always left with the doubt of whether the statistics are telling you the right. So we went into a number of different cities in a lot of depth. Okay. Here are the results. Let me explain this. So this is just a star diagram. It's normalized, low, medium, and high of 8 different things. Biomass, so renewable materials, basically. Fossil fuels, total energy, electricity, CO2 emissions, which is the only emission, but it's a consumption-based emission. It's a consumption proxy. Industrial metals and minerals, total materials, and then construction and metals and minerals. So you're being very patient with me on all this stuff. But here are the results. So for the several hundred cities that we've outlined, and we've added several hundred cities more since the first phase was finished, we're finding this kind of typology, 15 city types. So the most sustainable cities in the world today are the poorest, right? Because they don't actually serve their populations reasonably, right? That's not a model for the future. The least sustainable cities today, we all know and maybe love or hate. Sorry, my timer's done, so okay. 15 city types, and here are the cities. You can't read this, and I can't read this. So, Calcutta, Lagos. Remember, these things, where that point lands, is basically where that city consumes in terms of that resource, so in terms of biomass. So Calcutta, Phnom Penh, very low in biomass. Not because they don't eat food, because they eat very little food. Okay, so there's a per capita. So the most sustainable, quotes, are the poorest. That really goes all the way to here, where we're still talking about Cairo, Ho Chi Minh City. Then there's a little bit of a bump. There are a number of middle cities that have interesting resource consumption per capita. And then you start to ease into, well, the Chinese cities, well, London's there, Chinese cities, and then you get into the real profligate, wasters of our limited resources like Boston and Phoenix and Denver. Okay. Lisbon is, I always forget, but Lisbon's somewhere in here. Is it? Right here? Yes. Ah, yeah, there it is. Sorry, I'm not even seeing. One interesting little point about this, well, this is the first phase and we're going on, and others are now developing typologies, which is great. The only city type that contains cities only from one country is this type, this Japanese cities. We've tried like crazy to try to put cities into that type or to try to take a Japanese city out of that type and couldn't. They're like no other cities in the world. And to explain that, fairly low biomass per capita. They eat reasonably. Very high electricity, relatively low other energy, but a huge material throughput. It's a highly industrialized, relatively frugal nation. That's actually kind of unprecedented in the world. So the Japanese are different than all the rest of us. Okay, so, oops, what happened? Okay, now the final thing here, and it is the final thing, is to say, well, I've already implied, these are no models for the future, right? So I talked before about diversity and complexity, what are the diverse futures? These are no models, we don't want to go there. Remember, the vast majority of the addition to the urban population in the next 30 years is here. So the question is, are they going to remain sustainable, and is this going to remain to be hell on earth? And this is where you find it. Or we clearly don't want this as a model for the future because this is completely not possible. It's just not going to happen in the way that we've been doing in the past. So really the most interesting models are here in the middle. And what you have to then acknowledge is that we globally and I'm maybe I'm becoming more and more of an outlier in this opinion, but globally in the next 30 years, we are going to consume a lot more. We're going to become much less sustainable before we become sustainable, because this population should actually consume more. There's a certain equity and certain fairness about it all. I guess that's just the synonym. And they should move here, so they will consume more. So the question is, as these people justifiably increase their affluence by way of cities, we have the responsibility, I'm preaching to the choir probably, to reduce our consumption. But it's really these cities that are most interesting and how one can get these cities down here. So it's really more so Lisbon being in here is a great case study. And so we have another project, we have another grant for the next 3 years to do a test bed in a Lisbon neighborhood. How can you get these cities to become really energy efficient and material efficient and energy efficient and be the models for the future? Okay, so one last thing about this is that the other way to look at typology, sorry, I'm running over. The one way to look at typologies is to consider them as fluid. They're in flux. They're not monolithic, right? So those typologies will change over time. They're states. And essentially, one typology might be the latter state of another typology. That's another way to think about it. So then the question of transitions comes to mind. We've done a project, a 2-year project in the provinces of China to analyze the urban transitions. How did one city become like another city, become like another? How did it go from one type to the next? And we found that there's some very, very clear transition pathways. Heavy industrial to high profit industrial to service. That's a classic one. And Beijing has gone through an interesting transition. But we're also finding that there are inflection points where you can shift the transition of that city to a more sustainable or more resource efficient type. Whether or not you want to do that, it's a different question. Okay, I'm going to fast forward through these. We're doing this for Africa as well, an African urban typology. And if you want to know more, Balo and I wrote a book, Sustainable Urban Metabolism, came out of MIT Press last year, and it puts in one place a lot of what I've been talking about. Thank you.
Thank you, John. We just ran out of time, but I would like to invite one person to make one question. One person, one question.
How about Wendy? Over here.
Wendy.
I'm going to attempt to practice what I was preaching. So, fantastic. And they're fantastic.
Thank you.
I plan on looking at that a lot, especially your transition thought experiment was wonderful. But, leading off of that, what one change would most transform patterns of urban metabolism by 2050? If you could imagine one change that would completely derail that, what one change might it be?
So I'm going to answer your question in an annoying way, which is that the typology basically makes the point that there is no one way. In other words, there are, the typology being that you have these different states. And for me to go from one state, for me to go from the state of Japanese cities to a more resource-efficient future, totally different than what I would do in going from a more sustainable state in the Phoenix type to taking the Phoenix type and then going to a more sustainable state. So the point of the typology work is to say, let's mature the discussion a little bit about sustainable cities. It's not all about the generic Northern European, German neighborhood where everybody is totally on board with reducing their consumption and you have super energy efficient buildings and all that. That's not going to happen. Why? Because just go anywhere else besides Germany. And it's not the reality. Go to China. So China is wonderful because they have very progressive energy efficiency and these plans. Go to any building, any high-rise residential building, and look at the window. And I guarantee you can probably within the first 5 or 6 windows finished, right? You might be able to feel the air, cold air coming through. You might be actually to see the outside between the window frame and the rough opening. So the question is, so I'm sorry to answer it in an annoying way. It's kind of like global climate change generally. There is no one path. It's a whole set of pathways. But those set of pathways are more relevant to certain kinds of cities than others. One pathway might be relevant to certain kinds of cities more so than another. So that's my annoying answer. Thank you.